Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen.
Hello.
We are happy to have you with us. I am Pastor Jack, and this is
Pastor Matt.
Deleted Scenes. This is a part of our week where we take some time to go over some questions or go further into some details about the previous sermon from the most previous Sunday. And you are able to ask Pastor Matt questions that you might have about the sermon in the comment section, and we will get to those as soon as we possibly can. And so don't forget throughout this video that you can comment with those questions. So what's going to happen is I'm going to have some questions to ask Pastor Matt about the sermon, so we can go into a little bit more depth from this most recent sermon and just kind of understand Scripture a little bit better and the subject matter, which is Matthew, not this Matthew. Yeah, the Gospel of Matthew. Mm-hmm. Maybe, I don't know. I'm going to ask you a question about that, right?
About this Matthew. About who wrote the Gospel of Matthew.
Yeah.
Yes.
So yeah, we are excited to be with you. This I almost said this morning, man. As a pastor, you just get so trained, like Sunday morning, and then like Tuesday afternoon hits, and you're doing a live video, and you're like, this morning. Like, oh, that's not right.
I think I mentioned this before, but my boss, when I was a youth pastor, intentionally said good morning no matter what time of day it was.
Yeah,
that got stuck in my head.
Yeah.
Well, you may notice that it is snowing outside. It actually is snowing outside, but we decided to throw up a new background here in Studio A.
Studio A.
Studio A. A1 steak sauce. Sorry.
Yeah. We just have some steak sauce planted different places in the video all the time, and they have to find it and stuff.
I'm sure we could get some money for product placement there.
Oh, yeah, probably. That'd be nice, right? Put it towards the youth program.
There you go.
Good plug. Anyway, I'm going to start asking Pastor Matt some questions, and you can just enjoy the answers to that or not enjoy them. I don't know. Maybe.
Pressure.
No pressure, right? And then if that sparks anything in your mind, you're like, hey, I'd like to know more about this. Get your fingers typing on that keyboard and ask Pastor Matt those questions that you have. So without further ado, we're going to get into it. So our first question is, how do we know that Matthew actually wrote the Gospel of Matthew?
That is an excellent question. In terms of knowing that Matthew, the disciple, wrote the Gospel, the only way we know that for sure is to trust the text. Mm-hmm. There isn't a way to prove that Matthew actually wrote it. However, there is very, very strong evidence that the Gospel of Matthew has always been connected with Matthew. So one of the things that you'll find when you learn about the Gospels is that the titles are not considered part of the text. So some people, the predominant theory in secular institutions is that the titles were added later, and when they wrote the Gospels, and then they said, hey, well, who wrote this Gospel? I don't know. Let's say that Mark wrote it, or let's say that Matthew wrote it. And so they would say that the titles don't actually tell us anything about the Gospels. However, that doesn't quite make sense. That doesn't explain everything. Number one, mainly because each Gospel has only ever been called by that one name. Mm-hmm. And so the thing about the Gospels that actually really helps us to trust them is the fact that after they were written, from the moment the first copy was made, no one person had control over the text. So we know that the early church, they communicated a lot. They sent each other a lot of mail. So let's say Matthew writes the gospel, then he would typically, if you follow the process that we know that they normally followed, he would hand it to somebody who would make copies, and they would mail those copies to the main urban center churches, and those churches would make copies and mail them to the churches in their districts, in their areas. And as soon as that process happens, which would probably only take a matter of months, as soon as that happens, now you've got copies all over the place and no one can control all of them. So, in a matter of a century, they were all over the known world. And so the question is, if that's what happened, then how could everybody have decided that they thought Matthew wrote it without just on their own? Mm-hmm. Because we don't have any other name for the Gospel of Matthew. We don't have any record of it being called anything else but the Gospel of Matthew. The only rational explanation for that is that it was called the Gospel of Matthew from the first copies. and that the Gospel of Matthew was written on those copies that went everywhere, which means that from the earliest copies it's been associated with Matthew. Now, there's still then the question, do you trust that the person who wrote the Gospel was honest about who they were? And there's no way to prove that scientifically. It's a question of do you trust? But there is no real good explanation for how it could be called the Gospel of Matthew by everybody who had it 160 years later, except that it was called the Gospel of Matthew in the first copies.
All right. Well, Barb Schumacher's comment here says, love the background. So.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. He's going to say thank you for that one because he kind of chose it, but so.
Yes.
Anyway. So my next question comes under this point here of collecting taxes was an unclean and often dishonest profession. Mm-hmm. And so I just wanted to ask you, Matthew was doing this profession, and you mentioned earlier that he probably was raised as in a devout religious home. Did Matthew just not care about how he was raised or about the unclean versus clean idea? Did you just not care about that? Or?
Well, we don't know exactly why he became a tax collector. There are a few possibilities. One possibility is that it was the only way for him to make money. Like he needed a job, maybe because if he is a Levite and there were no other Levite jobs, the guy's got to make money, and he was desperate enough to take that job. Another idea might have been that he really just wanted to make a lot of money and he cared more about having a well-paying job than he did about keeping kosher. A third possibility is that he ended up just not believing in the kosher laws. There was a whole group of Jews, a whole segment of the population that did not really care about following the kosher laws. That continues to this day. In Judaism, there are branches of Judaism, and some of them are not really Reformed Judaism has much less emphasis on following the kosher laws. So it could have been that he didn't feel that it was important. And in that case, that would have meant he was what we call a Hellenistic Jew, where he mixed Jewish religion with Greek philosophy. That was actually a pretty common thing back then. So it might have been that he didn't even consider it an issue, but everybody in his village considered it an issue. Okay. Actually, there's a TV show called The Chosen that's I've been really impressed with. It's a multi-season series about the Gospels, and their explanation is that he's on the autism spectrum, so he's really good with numbers, but he's not good with people. Mm-hmm. So it's not as much of a burden to it actually fits with his personality. I thought that was an interesting take on it, but we have no way of knowing.
Yeah, for sure. So just kind of going more so into the generalized question area. What are some other things that would be considered unclean in Jewish law?
Like professions or just in general?
Professions in general, yeah.
So actually, one of the members of our church came up to me after the service and pointed out that one of the jobs that was considered unclean by the Pharisees was shepherding, because it kept you out in the fields all the time, which means you didn't have the ability to come in to observe Sabbath and to come to synagogue, and you wouldn't have really had access to the ritual washings. You'd wash in a creek, I guess, but shepherding means somebody has to be out in the field all the time. You don't clock out, and which is interesting because that meant that if shepherds are unclean, David was a shepherd, and so that puts you in kind of a bind when you start saying that. And yet, to enforce their cleanliness laws, they had to say shepherding was unclean. So anything that caused you to handle dead bodies would have made you unclean. Anything that caused you to handle unclean animals, scavenging animals. If you were a fisherman and you, let's say you wanted to fish and you you caught the wrong kinds of fish, but you wanted to sell them to Gentiles, that would make you unclean because there are only certain kinds of sea creatures and aquatic animals that you're supposed to eat. That would have made you unclean. There are a lot of things that would have made you unclean that were part of a profession that it's because the law of Moses is meant to be kept by an entire community. And so when the Jews start living within a community of surrounded by Gentiles, it becomes really hard to keep kosher.
Yeah.
So.
All right.
Yeah.
So next question here, and don't forget you can comment any questions that you might have for Pastor Matt. The next one here is, how do you think the other disciples felt about Matthew?
We don't have a lot on that. I have one theory. So a lot of them probably wouldn't have liked him for the same reason that other Jews kept their distance, and they would have been really uncomfortable with his presence. There's one piece of evidence that I have that makes me think that they really carried a prejudice against Matthew, which is Matthew is essentially an accountant. Mm-hmm. And so they have an accountant who's part of the 12. Who's in charge of the money for the 12? We find out in one of the Gospels that it's actually Judas. And Judas is robbing them. Like he's stealing from them. Mm-hmm. So to me, that indicates that they still didn't trust Matthew. Yeah. Because he's literally, he works with money. Mm-hmm. And they don't trust him with the money. Yeah. They don't trust him with the purse. So I think there was a lot of prejudice there.
Yeah. So my next question comes from this point where you talk about when Jesus called Matthew an unclean tax collector, he was practicing what he preached, right? And so I wanted to ask, is this Jesus calling Matthew? Is he specifically calling Matthew for Matthew? Like he says, I want Matthew to be a part of my ministry? Or is he calling Matthew kind of for like, yes, I want Matthew, but also I kind of want to make this point. Like you call him unclean, Jews, but he's going to be a part of the Messiah's ministry.
That the text doesn't really give us that much insight into Jesus's mindset. I hope, and I guess I realize as I'm about to say this. This is me projecting onto Jesus what I imagine he's like. That for Jesus, those two always go together, mm-hmm. because he knows the person and he cares about the person. And he knows Matthew and he loves people. He doesn't see them as means to an end. Mm-hmm. But in calling Matthew, it still sends a message. So maybe we might say he called Matthew for Matthew, but he called him in public to make a point. That might be it. Because he could have found Matthew walking home from work. He could have knocked on his house when he was at home, but he called him in public. So I would say my pastoral instinct is to say that he called Matthew for Matthew, but he called him in public to make the point.
Yeah. All right, that would make sense. So one of the things you kind of briefly touched on was that what Jesus's message wasn't something completely unheard of in some ways, and so Matthew would have heard some similar things of what Jesus was saying from other teachers. If this is the case, if what Jesus was saying wasn't all that different from other teachers, why do you think Jesus still stirred up such a crowd and stirred up people everywhere he went?
I think the two things that were different about what Jesus said was, first of all, it's one thing to preach high ideals, but in Judaism, you have all these rules that you have to follow that are a part of that. Mm-hmm. And where the rules overlap is where you run into issues. So it's one thing to say you should love everybody, but what about the rule that says you're not supposed to, that being around Gentiles is unclean? Or what about the rule? Like Jesus will get into all these controversies. Like you're supposed to love people, but you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. So what happens when what if you have to do work to love someone on the Sabbath? And all those crossovers. Jesus is not the first person to focus on the meaning of the law, about loving God and loving others, and about how we're supposed to treat other people. But what he does is he's the most thorough in carrying that through how he interprets everything. And he's willing to put that at the center of the whole thing. So he really sticks to his guns all the way through, and he also lives that out. So he is actually willing to prioritize some laws over others and say it is okay to technically break this law, the Sabbath law, for the sake of loving other people. So that's part of it, that he's really thorough about it, and he's really just exact. But also, when he makes his declarations, he makes them very authoritatively. Because not everything Jesus said was original, but everything Jesus said was said with authority, where he could say, no, there's no question. There's no debate. This isn't my opinion. This is the truth. And especially in Matthew will point out people's reactions that they're surprised with the authority that he teaches with. He just says, no, this is it. Yeah. And especially when you have a religious culture that is based on debating religious laws, the religious leaders in Jerusalem or in Judaism were a cross between a pastor and a lawyer. And if there are people who like to argue, it's pastors and lawyers.
Yeah.
And to just say, no, this is it, is not going to win those kinds of people over.
Yeah.
So that was very controversial.
Definitely. So yeah, don't forget again, you can comment any questions that you might have. My next question is this. Why do you think there seems to be this double standard in the church today of Jesus spending time with quote unquote unclean people like Matthew, right? Because I think a lot of us in the church would read the Bible and see Jesus kind of ministering to those we see as outcasts and saying, "Oh yes, that's what we should do," but then Christians and pastors today, some people might view them going and spending time in like a bar with different people and ministering to them. That seems to be kind of taboo in a way. Like, I don't like that a whole lot. What's pastor doing there? Why is he going and ministering to these people type deal? Why do you think there might be that double standard?
I'm not sure that I don't know if I'd call it a double standard. Well, there are double standards involved, but I think part of it is that same dynamic that we were just talking about with the Jews. Mm-hmm. That as Christians, we know that God has certain expectations for how we're going to live, and also for how we represent God's design to people. And so it's important for us to be distinct from the world to represent his plan for human life. Mm-hmm. And so how do you balance that with a concern for people who are living outside of God's plan and how we associate with them? And I think there are legitimate concerns on both sides, because I also think that you can go so far in the way you minister to people that you blur the lines and people can't actually tell that you're representing something different. That legitimately can happen. So it's an open thing that we have to struggle with. How do we draw that line? Yeah. And what does that look like? Because it's one thing to be a pastor who is willing to minister to people in bars, for instance. Mm-hmm. But there's also the concern of what does it say to people about, like, people who are struggling with alcoholism, to have a pastor in the bar. You know, it may or may not be an issue, and it may depend on which pastor, which church. But then that's also a whole other issue. Like, what if you're in there getting drunk, and how are you behaving in the bars? And then there's a question of, are you really there to minister, or are you there because you like being it? You know, there's all these things that are caught up in that. And I think there's legitimate room for people to wrestle with that and to disagree. Mm-hmm. I also think that we live in a time where there's prejudices on both sides, where there are people will look down on other Christians who are unwilling to go to the bars, or who are willing to go to the bars, or willing to go to those places, and they'll say, oh, we shouldn't go there. But then on the other side, there are also Christians who are prejudiced against that first group, the religious Christians, and they would never want to see their pastor in a suit and tie, or never want to see them, singing hymns, or there are prejudices all over the church, unfortunately, in different directions. And so one thing I don't really like is this idea that religious people are the ones getting it wrong. All Christians are getting it wrong somewhere. And we just have to earnestly and honestly struggle with that.
Yeah, definitely. So I only have one more kind of serious question here. And so this would be a perfect time for you to fire in any questions that you might have. And then I have kind of a random fun question, which I think is a doozy this time. So I'm looking forward to it. But so my last one is, why do you think people desire the morals and kind of life outlook of Christianity, but at the same time kind of don't want to join in on what's going on in the church, or kind of want to avoid the kind of serious aspects of Christianity, maybe?
I think that people, so in the sermon, I talked about the fact that a lot of people who aren't Christians still really like the ideals in the Sermon on the Mount, and will really hold them up, and often will throw them back at Christians who aren't upholding them. Yeah. You know, how often has somebody said to a Christian, Jesus said, don't judge, that kind of thing. I think that part of it is that Jesus is just right. And we can see that, and there's our moral sense can recognize that's just right. I think also it's because we have a lot of the things that Jesus talks about in the Sermon on the Mount, we can apply to big social level moral questions. He tends to focus on behaviors and social systems, and it's really easy for us to support those, because we can lay the responsibility on the system and not on me. Because whenever we get to Jesus's moral commands for me, then all of a sudden, that's when people check out. That's when
Yeah.
people say, "Nope, I'm good. That's meddling. That's antiquated. That's old-fashioned." But when we're talking about social structures or things that we can do through a welfare system or things like that, then we're all on board.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody has a part of what Jesus teaches that they like and a part that they don't like. Most people. But then the thing is, once you get into a church, suddenly it becomes real, because it's not just a matter of your preferences. It's not just a matter of, like, what's your favorite color, your favorite football team.
Mm-hmm.
It's a matter of you're actually being held to you're actually expected to live this out, and not just to whatever you happen to want to do at the time. There are other people with their own opinions and their own awareness of what Jesus taught, and you're going through this life together. And it's a whole other level. So that's another, I think that's an obstacle people run into. And then, of course, we should always recognize the obstacle that sometimes churches really fail at this, and they hurt people in that process, and people just want nothing to do with that anymore.
Yeah.
So liking what Jesus says and doing what Jesus says are vastly different things.
Yes. Yep. All right, so that kind of concludes the serious note of this deleted scenes. So I have one final question, and so if you have any questions, now would be the time to do it, as we're kind of discussing this final question. And so here it is. So someone comes up to you, says, Matt, your life has been interesting enough that we want to make a movie about you.
Uh-huh.
So
Naturally.
it's kind of a two-part question here.
Okay.
First off, who do you want to play you?
Chris Pratt.
Okay,
I
that
thought
was
about
easy.
this.
Yeah. Second off, what songs are in your soundtrack?
Oh, man. Okay, Chris Pratt plays me.
Why Chris Pratt? Real quick.
I like him. He's funny, and I liked him. I like him now, but I also liked him before he was like a superhero physique kind of, because he's in not Community. He's in
Parks and Recreation.
Parks and Recreation, and he's just goofy and funny, and I've liked him in everything he's done. So there's that. So that's why Chris Pratt. Also, soundtrack. I would want the soundtrack to be mainly Switchfoot.
Okay.
Mainly Switchfoot, just because that is the soundtrack of my life, is mainly Switchfoot.
Sure.
So,
All
and then John Williams. Well, or it depends. Orchestral score, John Williams. Nothing but John Williams. If he's not available, maybe Hans Zimmer.
Yeah.
But mainly John Williams. But if it's a band, then Switchfoot.
All right. And with that kind of concludes our deleted scenes for the week. So that was fun.
Yeah.
Make sure you tune in with us next week. I believe we will be back on Thursday afternoon, correct?
Yeah, as far as I know,
Yep.
we're back on.
All right. Yep. Sounds like a plan. Thursday at 3 next week, deleted scenes. Be here. Not physically here.
That wouldn't work.
Yeah, that would destroy all kinds of COVID protocols and things like that. So
And we also don't have any seating here,
Yeah,
so
also-
you just have
also
to
that.
watch through the little window in the door.
and it wouldn't be very good audio. So
No.
stay where you're at, but be here online with us live streaming, because that's and come with questions next week. We haven't had questions for a few weeks, and we like those. We like interacting with the questions. So come ready with some of those things. When you listen to the sermon, listen to it for the purpose of asking questions.
Like the hardest questions you can.
Yeah, even if you're like, Pastor Matt, that was wrong, and this is why. Explain why you went with the other way, or something like that. I don't know.
Sure.
Yeah. Anyway, this has been Deleted Scenes, and I'm Pastor Jack.
I'm Pastor Matt. Stay healthy, stay hopeful, and go in peace to love and serve the Lord. See you later.